This module is about literary forms. Module 1. I am Dr.R.Manimozhi, Assistant Professor of English, A.D.M.College for Women, Autonomous Nagapattinam. Let us first see about the objectives of this course. To identify the important elements of various genres, to understand the various literary terms, to learn the critical and theoretical terms in literature, to gain knowledge of various literary devices, genres and forms, and also to analyze and interpreting the literary devices. Unit 1 includes the role of literature, nature and elements of poetry, definitions of poetry, classifications of poetry, subjective and objective poetry. First, let us see the role of literature. Literature is the foundation of life. It helps the reader to express themselves. It helps to learn new facts. It teaches history and culture. It makes the reader a critical thinker. It teaches humanity to be sensitive and empathetic towards others. It also provides an outlet for thoughts and emotions and imagination. Total, literature reflects what is happening in the world. Now let us see what is literature and purpose of literature, function, character and element of literature. Literature is a method of recording, preserving and transmitting knowledge and entertainment. It can also have a social, psychological, spiritual or political role. Now let us see the purpose of literature. The main purpose of literature is to entertain and give aesthetic pleasure. And functions of literature. Literature has a great function in developing humans' feelings, ideas and interests. It means that literature teaches particular values, gives messages and themes to the readers. Characteristics of literature. It works with the joy, sorrow, faith, love, hate and fear is its universality. Element of literature is language. It is defined as a system of communicating ideas and feelings through signs, sounds and gestures. In this lecture, let us know about poetry in detail because poetry is a genre of literature. Let us first see the history of literature and then nature of literature, elements of literature and forms of literature. Now poetry. Poetry is an art form in which human language is used for its aesthetic qualities in addition to or instead of its notional and semantic content. It consists largely of oral or literary works in which language is used in a manner that is felt by its user and audience to differ from ordinary prose. It may use condensed or composed form to convey emotion or ideas to the reader's or listener's mind or ear effects. Poems frequently rely for their effect on imagery, word association and the musical qualities of the language used. Because of its nature of emphasizing linguistic form rather than using language purely for its content, poetry is notoriously difficult to translate from one language into another. In most of the poetry, the power of words, it means meaning of the words, are most important. These shades and nuances of meaning can be difficult to interpret and can cause different reader to hear a particular piece of poetry differently. While there are reasonable interpretations, there can never be a perfect interpretation. Now let us see the history of poetry. Poetry as an art form predates literacy. In pre-literate societies, poetry was frequently employed as a means of recording oral history, storytelling, genealogy, law and other forms of expression. The Ramayana, a Sanskrit epic which includes poetry, was probably written in the 3rd century BC in a language described by William Jones as more perfect than Latin, more copious than Greek, and more exquisitely refined than either. The greater part of the world's sacred scriptures are made up of poetry rather than prose. The use of verse to transmit cultural information continues today. Pre-literate societies lacking the means to write down important cultural information use similar methods to preserve it. Some writers believe that poetry has its origins in song. Most of the characteristics that distinguish it from other forms of utterance, rhythm, rhyme, compression, intensity of feeling, the use of refrains helps to fit words to musical forms. From 20th century, the narrators reconstruct the poem from memory. The development of literacy gave rise to more personal and shorter poems. Let us see the nature of poetry. Poetry is a type of literature that conveys a thought, describes a scene, or telling a story in a concentrated lyrical arrangement of words. Poems can be structured with the rhyming lines and meter. The rhythm and emphasis of a line based on syllabic beats. Poems can also be free form, which follows no formal structure. Prose poetry combines the characteristics of poetry with the superficial appearance of prose, such as in Robert Frost's poem Home Burial. Other forms include narrative poetry and dramatic poetry, both of which are used to tell stories and so resemble novels and plays. However, both these forms of poetry use the specific features of verse composition to make these stories more memorable or to enhance them in some way. Elements of poetry. Sound in poetry is the most vital element. Sound in poetry is called as rhythm. The rhythm of each line is arranged in a particular meter. Different types of meter played key roles in classical, early European, Eastern and modern poetry. Poetry in English and other modern European languages often uses rhythm. Rhythm at the end of lines is the basis of a number of common poetic forms, such as ballads, sonnets, rhyming couplets. However, the use of rhythm is not universal. Much modern poetry, for example, avoids traditional rhythm schemes. Furthermore, classical Greek and Latin poetry did not use rhythm. Alliteration played a key role in structuring early Germanic and English forms of poetry. Alliteration and rhythm used in poetic structures help to emphasize define a rhythmic pattern. In addition to the forms of rhyme, alliteration and rhythm that structure much poetry, sound plays a more subtle role in even free verse poetry in creating pleasing varied patterns and emphasizing or sometimes even illustrating semantic elements of the poem. Devices such as alliteration, assonance, assonance means verse, consonance, dissonance and internal rhythm are among the ways the poets use sound. Euphony refers to the musical flowing quality of words arranged in an aesthetically pleasing way. Now let us see the poetry and form. Compared with prose, poetry depends less on the linguistic units of sentences and paragraphs and more on units of organization that are purely poetic. The typical structural element are the line, couplet, strophe, stanza and verse, paragraph. Lines may be self-contained units of sense, as in the well-known lines from William Shakespeare's Hamlet, to be or not to be. It is a question. It may instances the effectiveness of a poem derives from the tension between the use of linguistic and formal units. With the advent of printing, poets gained greater control over the visual presentation of their work. As a result, the use of these formal elements and of the white space they help to create become an important part of the poet's toolbox. Modernistic poetry tends to take this to an extreme with the placement of individual lines or groups of lines on the page forming an internal part of the poem's composition. In its most extreme form, this leads to the writing of concrete poetry. Now, we are going to see various definitions of poetry. William Wordsworth defines poetry as poetry is the spontaneous overflow of feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. William Shakespeare defined it as a poem is energy transferred from where the poet got it by way of the poem itself, all the way over to the reader. And Robert Frost says that poetry is a process, poetry is the renewal of words. According to John Keats, poetry is a form of escape. Walt Whitman described poetry as the idea of poetry must be true to life. And Emily Dickinson strongly defined poetry as, if I read a poem and it makes my whole body so cold, so fire can warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. Poetry is the criticism of life, said by Matthew Arnold. And Dylan Thomas said that poetry is what makes me laugh or cry or yawn, what makes my toenails twinkle, what makes me want to do this or that or nothing. And Plato, the great Greek philosopher, objected that poetry plays on the emotions and thus undermines the highest part of our soul, the part that should at all times be in control. Another Greek philosopher, Aristotle, cunningly showed using the notion of catharsis that while poetry does indeed play on the emotions, it does so in a way that enhances our reasoning. Poetry is imitation. And at last, poetry is a piece of writing expressing feeling and ideas that are given intensity by particular attention to diction. It is the definition found in Oxford Dictionary. Now let us see the classification of poetry. Poetry is classified into two forms, objective poetry and subjective poetry. Objective poetry is impersonal and the subject matter is external objects. Subjective poetry is personal and subject matter is the poet's own thoughts and feelings. Now let us see the objective poetry in detail. It is older than subjective. The primitive people among whom it developed, like the uncivilized races in some parts of the world today, were more interested in what they saw and heard than in what they thought. They valued the experiences of their eye and ear more than the experience of their mind. Deep thinking may even have been tedious to them, considering that their life was simple, composed more of action than of thought. Their poetry, therefore, dealt with deeds, events, and things they saw around them, and it called for the little mental efforts from their hearers. At the early stage, man has not acquired a subjective outlook, which is the product of civilization. The epic and the drama are the forms of this objective poetry, in which, as in the ballad, the writer's personality remains in the background. The lyric and the elegy, which belongs to the later times, represent the subjective variety. Objective poetry is ballads, folk songs, historical songs, and metrical romances, and its poetical forms are ballads and epics. For example, relics of ancient English poetry written in 1765 by Thomas Percy. Subjective poetry, on the other hand, self-expression and personal opinion of the poet, and its poetical forms are the lyric, elegy, sonnet and ode. For example, William Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey and P.B. Shelley's Ode to West Wind. Now, subjective poetry in detail. Subject matter which is supplied by external objects such as deeds, events and the things we see around us, and that which is supplied by the poet's own thought and feeling. The former gives rise to objective poetry, the latter to subjective poetry. In objective poetry, the poet acts as a detached observer, describing what he has seen or heard. In the other hand, he brings to bear his own reflections upon what he has seen or heard. The same subject matter can be viewed either way. If the poet views it from without conforming himself, that is to say merely to his externals, his treatment is objective. If he views it from within, giving expression, this is to say to the thoughts and feelings it arouses in his mind, his treatment is subjective. Objective poetry is impersonal and subjective poetry is personal. In the former, the focus of attention is something that is outward, a praiseworthy act, a thrilling occurrence, a beautiful sight. In the latter, that means in subjective poetry, it is the poet himself, whatever the subject may be, his mind is centered on his own thoughts and feelings. Sometimes subjective poetry elements and objective poetry elements combined in one poetry. For example, Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach and G.M. Hopkins' God's Grandeur. Hope you have understood the classifications of poetry. Unit 2 will be continued in next module.